Hello, my name is Jeremiah Jerkowitz, and I serve as the LGBTQ Resource Center Pluralism and Diversity Coordinator in the Office of Student Life at the College of Staten Island. And I would like to welcome you to Ally Training, which I will be taking you through today to help students better understand the LGBTQ community and potentially build more allies. So I'll be taking you through a PowerPoint presentation, and afterwards there will be a short quiz to see how much you learned from the training. So if you did not know, the LGBTQ Resource Center is an office space that's located in the campus center, building 1C, room 226, and we're open Monday through Friday for students to visit when we are on campus. So our mission at the LGBTQ Resource Center is right here. It says, "This is a safe space. I am understanding, non-judgmental, and willing to provide an atmosphere of acceptance and assistance for members of the LGBTQ community." You might already feel this way. Hopefully that you might feel this way sometime in the future. But we're going to talk through things and see how it goes. So first, we're going to go through some terminology. Terminology is a great way to get to know a community and better support them. Understand what are the words that they use and what do they mean, what's positive, what's negative, and such. So gender and gender identity. So gender is a building block to understanding the LGBTQ community. So often gender and sex get interchanged, but they're actually different and have different definitions. So sex is biological, where gender is social. So our sex is our biology. It's rooted in science. It's more than just our genitalia. It's all our deep genetics, all the way down to our chromosomes. Much of our biology we can't actually see with the naked eye. Where gender is social. It's how we interact with one another. And which is more important to our everyday lives? It's our gender, right? We cover up our sex, our biology, with clothing. We have determined that as human beings, that that's how we operate in the world. So I try to get across that gender is the much more important thing. So the definition for gender is a socially constructed system of classification that ascribes qualities of masculinity and femininity to people. Gender characteristics can change over time and are different between cultures, right? So gender, what's important to understand is it's something that we all operate by, the majority of us, but it's created by humans, right? It's not necessarily real. And we can point to it changing because the way that we have treated men and women throughout time has changed. At one point in US history, it wasn't unacceptable for a woman to wear pants. That has obviously changed. And our clothing is an expression of our gender. So that has changed and further supports that it's ever changing and it's not truly real. It's what we make of it as humans, as individuals. So it's important to understand that. Gender, as they point, is between our ears. It's in our brain. It's how we see ourselves. And the more modern approach to it is called gender identity. So it's the internal perception of one's gender and how they label themselves based on how much they align or don't align with what they understand their options for gender to be. And there are many different labels for gender, and there have been many different labels throughout time. Many people like to say that all these new genders are new, and there have been a multitude of genders throughout history. We might just have not been learning about them. Many in Southeast Asia, some African tribes, and many Native American tribes, they recognize gender variance in their societies. And many times they were considered holy or blessed because they were experiencing something that the majority of people didn't get to experience for their gender variance. So that's gender and gender identity. So sexuality or sexual orientation. These terms are really used interchangeably. They mean the same thing. So don't have to worry about using one over the other. But basically, sexuality is the inclination or capacity to develop intimate, emotional, and or sexual relationships with people of the same gender, the other gender, either gender, all genders, or no genders. And those all have words that define them. But basically, we separate this into three parts: intimate, emotional, and sexual. and or sexual, actually. And so often we put the focus on the sexual part of relationships. We cannot understand one another, and why would a person do this sexually? You don't need to understand how everybody does the sexual part of their relationships. But can you understand the intimate and emotional connection that we feel to one another, right? Love, compassion, kindness. I think everybody can understand that. And that transcends gender or sex, right? So hopefully you can understand that the intimate and emotional connection are the most important part of sexuality. And the sexual part is just part of it. But everybody has their own way that they express it. Lesbian. So we're going to go through the acronym LGBTQ now, and what does each letter mean. And it's important to say this, right? Sometimes when I do these trainings in person, I ask students to say the word out loud, because this is not a bad word, right? Any word can be used in a negative way, but this is a word used with pride and happiness in our community. So a lesbian is a woman who has sexual or romantic attraction to other women. It's a common and acceptable word for women only, and it's kind of grown to more of a non-men, non-male word, right? There are many people of other genders that also like to use the word lesbian. So this is the first letter in the acronym. Gay. So this is the most probably known word. So it's someone who is attracted to the same gender, usually used to describe men, but may be used to describe women as well. So this can be used for men or women. It's also used as what we call an umbrella term. So an umbrella term is where it refers to a lot more people or identities than it might not necessarily seem. So it can be used as an umbrella term for the entire LGBTQ community, right? We have gay pride. That is for everyone in the community. And a lot of people, they might identify as one of a lesser known identity. And so they might just choose to tell people that they're gay because they want it to be understood that they're LGBTQ, but they might not want to go into a whole training like this to explain who they are. So gay. Bisexual. So bisexual is a person who has emotional, physical, or sexual attraction to both men and women, right? This is a completely valid identity. I hear so often from young bisexual people that they still experience discrimination, not just from straight heterosexual people, but also from gay and lesbian people, with stereotypes like they're greedy or I would never date a bisexual person. They're valid, right? It doesn't mean that bisexual people can be monogamous if that's what they want. And they're not more likely to cheat than any other person of any other identity. So it's important that we recognize them and support them. And there are many people in our community that get labeled as gay or lesbian who actually identify as bisexual, like Freddie Mercury from Queen. He identified as bisexual during his lifetime. Transgender. So transgender is within the gender identity. So let me get the definition for you. So transgender, also trans is acceptable for short, is a person who identifies with a gender other than the one assigned at birth. So at its very simplest form, that's all it is. It doesn't have to do with somebody's body. It doesn't have to do with what they're doing with themselves or what they're changing. It's really just someone who identifies with a gender other than the one assigned at birth. And I want to point out that we use the term assigned at birth, right? It's not a baby's fault that they were assigned something at birth. And it's not really everybody's doing their best. So it doesn't come off as negative from birth. It's just that that's what they were told who they were, right? So again, I point out that gender is between our ears in our brain. And if that's how your brain sees who you are, that is who you are. And we are more than just our bodies, right? We have grown so much and in our thinking that we're more than what our body deems us to be. So A transgender person, they might transition. That signifies any changes that they might make in their life to better align with who they are and their gender, right? So our names are very important to us as a way to express our gender. So it's important when a transgender person tells you what their name is to accept that name, not question it. Um, and also, not say you don't look like you are that name. Pronouns are very important. So respecting a trans person's pronouns is of utmost importance. And asking people if you don't know what their pronouns, just say, oh, what pronouns do you use? And if we get more used to that, that's something we can ask everybody. And then there's all the way to medical transition, which a person should do with a doctor who is knowledgeable in that to make it safest. And that can really be rewarding for a trans person to um, better see who they are inside. But it's all individual. No transgender person is going to have the same journey, and there is no one way to be trans. Every way of trans identity is valid. Cisgender. So this is on the opposite end of the spectrum, where transgender meant someone who identifies with a gender differing from what they were assigned at birth. Cisgender means a person who identifies with the gender as or sex that they were assigned at birth. So I identify as a cisgender man. So this word was created by the trans community to refer to everyone else while being respectful to everyone else and also respecting their own identity. Because before cisgender, there wasn't really a word to describe what it was to be not transgender. So cis, C-I-S, is actually a Latin word meaning same. So same gender and transgender, transition gender. So those are the two words. And this isn't a negative word. It's just a way to describe a person's identity. So questioning. So questioning is not typically a label that is used in our community, but we have it to allow space. So basically questioning is a person who is in the process of exploring or discovering their sexuality, gender identity, or gender expression, right? So often as a young person, we are not told about all of these identities and said these are how some people identify and how they experience the world. So it can be understandable that anyone at any age can come to question that and come to question who they are and not figure out. So it's okay to question. You don't have to rush into an identity. You can try on identities and say, does this work for me? Is this truly how I feel? I always tell students that are questioning to do some reading, do some, research online, and see if your local LGBT center has people who identify with maybe the way that you want to identify or are trying to figure it out. Meet some people, do some exploring, but allow yourself the time to do that. So that's questioning. Queer. So this word has a lot of questions around it because it's not truly understood. So queer at its origin is a pejorative term for gay people, meaning it was a negative term, a slur used against the LGBTQ community. But many LGBT people have reclaimed this term as one that describes inclusive, non-heterosexual people, right? So there was a group called Queer Nation here in the New York City that a big part of their mission was reclaiming this word, taking the negativity away from it and saying, you can't use it against us because we use it with pride. Some people might use this as a way to describe their sexuality, meaning whatever they want it to mean. It could mean I'm attracted to anyone, I'm open to relationships with anyone, or whatever they want it to mean. Their gender. So there's terms like gender queer, non-binary, and gender non-conforming. So we talked about how gender is a creation, right, by humans. So there are people who feel that that doesn't work for them. These labels, these expectations, it doesn't work for them. So they want to identify with something else, right? Another gender, their own gender, or none of the above. But very often, genderqueer, gender non-binary folks will use they, them, their as a singular non-gendered pronoun, which is completely accurate. A number of dictionaries have been adding it as a singular non-gendered pronoun, so it's okay. It can be hard to get used to, but it's important to try to do that. So many times it's used in literary and scholarly works. At the College of Staten Island, we have a queer studies course, and that's a whole area of study. Some people can major in that at other colleges. Uh, this is also used as an umbrella term to refer to the entire LGBT community, so the queer community. But more often than not, this is a word that's okay to be used by an LGBT person, but not someone who doesn't identify as LGBTQ. Um, but there are still a lot of people that don't like the word. They still see it as a negative, and that's completely valid. So they should be respected for their wishes for them not to be referred to that way. So that's what queer means. Intersex. So this is probably the most unheard of word when I do trainings, but let me get the definition for you. So intersex is a general term used for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with a reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to fit the typical definitions of female or male. Right there, the word you might know is hermaphrodite, and that is an outdated, offensive word. Intersex is the modern, acceptable word for this community. And there are stereotypes with this community about their genitals, about their bodies, and that's not necessarily true. Intersex is basically any variance on what the medical community has established as what being male and being female is. So really we have three sexes: male, female, and intersex. And this can present in many different forms. And some people don't even know that they're intersex. It's actually deep within their genetics where they can have what they call mosaic genetics. They could have XX chromosomes as well as XY. One example of this was there was an Olympic athlete, runner, who was accused of using performance enhancing drugs, and she agreed to testing because she wasn't using it. And through the testing, they found out that she was intersex, and she was in her 20s, and she didn't even know this. And eventually it was determined by the Olympic Committee that she was not allowed to compete with other women just because of this slight biological variance in her. She still had to be very good at her sport to get to the Olympics. So intersex is something that's not very often talked about, even in the LGBTQ community, and still face great discrimination. What used to be common in the United States was surgery at birth on babies that presented as intersex. But what has been fought for and advocated for is to leave babies alone, let their bodies develop however they will develop, and that child, parents, doctor, they can make medical decisions later in life when they're able to consent and have a say in it. Some countries like Germany, you can mark intersex on your birth certificate, and even New York City now, they have an X option that can go on birth certificates, which might benefit an intersex person or a non-binary genderqueer person. Coming out. So coming out is a process that the LGBTQ community uses, in which they say they are going to tell others about their sexuality and gender identity. Because it's always assumed that we're straight and cisgender, a lot of people in our community still have to come out and tell others. And it has varying effects. It can be positive, it can be very negative, right? People are celebrated for coming out, and people are kicked out of their homes and are physically attacked and killed for coming out. To this day, it still happens, even here in the United States, especially to the transgender community. This is not something that happens once, right? An LGBTQ person might have to come out every day of their lives because of certain interactions that happen, right? We ask questions of each other, and sometimes we automatically make an assumption with our questions. And an LGBTQ person has to think, do I tell them the truth? Do I not? And a lot of times it's thinking about their safety and whether they're going to be harassed or not. like anybody else, we all want to go through our lives without being harassed just because of who we are. So that's coming out. And an ally. So an ally is anyone, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, whose attitude and behavior is anti-heterosexist and who works toward combating homophobia, transphobia, and heterosexism both on a personal and institutional level, right? So you can be an ally. Anybody can be an ally. So I don't identify as transgender, but I'm definitely an ally to my transgender community within our community. So that's important. And it's not just yelling and, protesting is a great way to be an ally, but it's working on your own uncomfortabilities. Maybe your family says negative things about the LGBTQ community, so you can engage them in conversations. Maybe a classmate of yours says something inappropriate and you can speak up in a classroom. There's many different ways to be an ally, so I encourage you to explore that and do what you can to support not just the LGBTQ community, but all communities, but everyone, Black communities, brown communities. There's many ways to be an ally. So just some visual reaffirmation of what we just talked about. Biological sex, there's female, male, and intersex. Gender presentation. So that's how we present our gender. We can do that with our clothing, with I have some facial hair, if you wear makeup or not, your haircut, jewelry, all of those things. How we walk, how we talk can be feminine, masculine, or androgynous, can be both and neither. That's sometimes purposeful. A person might want to look androgynous, or it just might be natural to their body. Gender identity, so it's separate from your biological sex. It's how you personally identify, right? Who you are and how you see yourself overrides what's going on with your body, right? A woman is still a woman, even if she has her breasts removed, right? So that should be, that those same principles should be applied to the transgender community and non-binary community. So why do I do this training? Why are allies needed for the LGBTQ community? So LGBTQ people have higher incidences of alcohol and drug abuse, depression, suicide, and homelessness when compared to heterosexual cisgender peers. If you did not know of homelessness, of the homeless youth population in the United States, 42% identifies as LGBTQ. So almost half of all the homeless youth in our country identify with this one community because of many reasons of being kicked out of homes, leaving homes because of it being an abusive environment. And in New York City, we have a large homeless youth population, and many cities do, because that's where LGBTQ youth will go thinking there will be services there, and that there are not enough for the amount. And unfortunately, the numbers have not gone down since marriage equality, since the acceptance of gay, lesbian, and bi people in the military. Homelessness is still a major issue for our community and for everyone. And thinking about colleges, right? So a study of colleges, because we are a college, they found that 23% of the LGBTQ and 39% of the transgender participants had experienced harassment on campus. 63% of participants hide their gender identity, and 43% hide their sexual identity to try to avoid intimidation. 1/3 of the LGBTQ and 38% of the transgender participants have seriously considered leaving their institution because of the negative climate. So one thing to note is the higher numbers for all of the transgender participants in this survey. And that goes for everything at the top of the slide. Transgender people face some of the highest discrimination in our world. And in the US, it's especially targeted towards Black transgender women. They make up the majority of murders of transgender people every year. And right, it's just simply, if an LGBTQ person does not feel accepted on their campus, they're less likely to finish their degree or might transfer to a campus that they feel is more welcoming to them. So perception, right? So these are some questions that are commonly said or asked of LGBTQ people, and they're just flipped around, right? So I just encourage you to think about the questions that you ask. Would you ask this of a straight cisgender person? If not, maybe it's not appropriate to ask when first meeting an LGBTQ person. So here we're going to go through some problematic questions and speech, right? So what's your real name or old name? That's to the transgender community, right? It's important that the name that they give us, we respect. And for many of them, their past name, their old name, they refer to as their dead name. Because it's a time they were not able to be themselves. They might have faced a lot of oppression um, and internal struggle. So it's not always comfortable for a transgender person to share that. Are you lesbian, gay, straight, bi? You shouldn't be asking outright people's identities. Get to know them, and they probably will share who they are. And then, do you have a boyfriend or do you have a girlfriend? When we ask that, one, like, just do you have a boyfriend? You're making an assumption about the person that you're asking that to. And on the next slide, I'll show you a better way. Are you the boy or the girl in the relationship? Right? Like, every relationship does not have to mimic a heterosexual straight one. And if you're asking about sexual positions of people, that is not appropriate. That's not an okay question. We've all heard that's so gay, especially when we were younger. What surgeries have you had? That's the transgender intersex community. Not appropriate. You wouldn't ask someone about their cancer treatment or oh, have you had plastic surgery done to you? Those are inappropriate questions to ask someone upon first meeting. And what are you, right? Like, or are you a boy or a girl? Better way to ask those questions. That's not really sex, or how do you have sex? So often I hear LGBTQ people are just automatically asked about sex because they think that's an okay thing to talk about with LGBTQ people. And that's not an appropriate thing to do when first meeting someone. And there's a multitude of ways to have sex. That, again, is individual. You don't act or sound or look like, right? That could, like, a man, or you don't act gay. You don't look like a lesbian. There's no one way to be any identity, right? Even straight. There's a multitude of ways. So we need to break down those assumptions that everybody who's LGBTQ has to look or act or sound a certain way. How are you going to have kids is so often asked by parents and older folks. One, people are not mandated to have children. We shouldn't make that a full expectation of everyone. And there are a multitude of ways to have children nowadays. Do you have a penis or a vagina? What do you have down there? A lot of people have strong reactions to when I say this because they're like, how could anybody ask that? But transgender and intersex people get those. That's a very common question for them to be asked. And it is very inappropriate and very invasive. We talked about bi people are more likely to cheat. That's not true. And yeah, being a man or a woman. So some of those questions can be revised. So instead of what are you, or are you a boy or a girl, what gender pronouns do you use, or how do you identify your gender? Those are very appropriate questions. When an LGBTQ person hears that, especially a trans person, they're saying, oh, this person is letting me tell them who I am. They're not making an assumption of that. Instead of do you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, or do you have a husband, do you have a wife? Are you in a relationship? Do you have a partner? Are you dating someone? Right? Those are open-ended questions to anyone. Anybody can answer that the way that they truly are. And instead of what is your real name, what is your preferred or chosen name, or just stick to what's your name. Let the person tell you. So some negative words that just shouldn't be said at all. Transvestite is a negative word to refer to the trans community. Alternative lifestyle, or even calling LGBTQ identity a lifestyle, is offensive, because a lifestyle is a choice. And the vast majority of LGBTQ people will say they did not choose this for themselves. It's how they genuinely, naturally feel. A lifestyle is being vegetarian, doing CrossFit. Those are choices that you make. Hermaphrodite, dyke, faggot, tranny, and transsexual, all offensive terms. Transsexual used to be a term that was used by the trans community because it was the original one created by a doctor. But as our understanding grew, transgender is now the acceptable term. The gay or the homosexual agenda, we don't have an agenda except to be ourselves and to promote equality for everyone. And even fairy and no homo is said very often between men that are showing affection for one another. It denotes that you see it as a negative to be seen as gay, and that there's something wrong with male affection, that there needs to be a clause said while you're doing it. So some tips on how to be an ally. Don't assume everyone is straight or gay, cisgender or transgender. You could just period that at don't assume. Try to break down those assumptions, and that's hard, but just get to know people where they are. Don't out someone, right? So somebody who tells you that they're LGBTQ, unless they tell you that they're completely out, they might not be. And it's important to keep that safe with yourself and not tell that, because there can be very real consequences for outing someone. When speaking, be aware of your environment and audience. Because there's no outside factor for determining an LGBTQ person, what you say could be heard by an LGBTQ person. So often when I talk with students, they tell me about how their groups of friends talk and refer to LGBTQ people. If it's in a negative way, they're less likely to tell their friends that they're LGBTQ themselves. Use all-inclusive language, those different ways that we talked about. Respect people's gender and pronouns. It's really important. Be willing to admit when you make a mistake and correct yourself, right? So often people who say that they're allies think they can do no wrong, but we can all make mistakes, including myself. I apologize to students when I make mistakes all the time. So being a good ally is being willing to admit that you made a mistake, and you just say a quick apology. It doesn't have to be a big deal. Educate others when it's safe. Interrupt prejudice and take action against oppression, even when people from the target group are not present. So just because you don't know if an LGBTQ person is present in a situation, you should still speak up for any group of people. Don't expect an LGBTQ person to speak for the entire LGBTQ community, right? They are just an individual. They don't represent the entirety. Nobody can, because we're such a vast and widely different community. We represent all races, all religions, all ethnicities, all genders, because LGBTQ people are everywhere. We're a natural part of society, of our world. Give space and opportunity to those of marginalized communities to be heard. Let people share who they are. Let them get their ideas out. People are more than just labels, right? At the core, we're all people. And treat others as they want to be treated. That's called the platinum rule. You should treat them how they want to be treated, not how you want to be treated. So that's my training for you today. This is my contact information. If you have any questions, want to learn more, we have a library of books in the LGBTQ Resource Center when we are on campus, but we have them listed online, so you could maybe get a suggestion for a book to read. But please reach out if you have any questions. And I want to thank you for watching the training, and there will be a small quiz following this. So thank you so much, and have a great day.